All right, welcome everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining NTCA and the Fiber Broadband Association today as we kick off our Fiber Delivers campaign, which is appropriately during Infrastructure Week. So one of the things that we all know, and we've certainly learned even more deeply over the course of the past year, is that broadband access is really a critical infrastructure issue. And ensuring that all Americans, regardless of where they live, have access to fast, reliable internet has really far-reaching consequences and implications for both urban and rural residents alike. So one of the things that folks talk a lot about, what is the right technology? And I will share that, while it will take every tool in the toolkit to really get that goal of all Americans connected, it's really going to be focused on fiber because fiber provides the best performance. It is ultra fast. You are able to do symmetrical uploads and downloads and has very low latency. And again, all of the things that we have learned over the course of last year, how important that fast connection really is. When we've got folks sitting at the kitchen counter doing their schoolwork, somebody on their VPN, all of the different connectivity going on. Fiber delivers education, teleworking, telehealth, precision agriculture, and access to news, entertainment, gaming, and social platforms, all critical things. We also know that fiber delivers on economic development and increased home values. And again, while a lot of other technologies have a role to play, many of those technologies themselves actually are fiber-fed products. So that is why I think the discussion today that we have teed up is going to be so informative, and I'm actually very much looking forward to it. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists who are with us here today. We have Gary Bolton, who is the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Gary has a long, rich history in the telecommunications space. And while he joined the Fiber Broadband Association as CEO in 2020, a memorable year, he served as the vice president on global marketing and government affairs for Adtran. So again, has the perspective on all different sides. We have Jim Segment, who is the president and CEO of CostQuest Associates. In this role, Jim has worked with a wide variety of companies and state and government agencies in support of broadband deployment. And his work is work that I have long admired for its real in-depth look into this space. And we have Ernesto Falcon, who's the Senior Legislative Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he focuses on intellectual property, open internet issues, broadband access, and competitive policy. And I will say that I enjoy reading his blog and his insights greatly. So my thanks to all of you for joining us here today to share some of your thoughts. What we're going to do is I'm going to kick off and ask you folks to kind of share some thoughts on some specific questions that I have teed up for all of you. But we're also going to have the opportunity for anybody joining us today to ask some questions as well. So go ahead and plug your questions into the chat function. Looking forward to some robust discussion going forward here today. So Gary, I'm going to kick off with you. We're meeting right now during Infrastructure Week. As Congress is considering all of these various infrastructure proposals, could you share a little bit about why broadband should be considered infrastructure and why digital infrastructure is just as critical these days as all of the talk about building roads and bridges and airports?
Thanks, Shirley. And, I really appreciate you inviting me to join you guys today, and especially this great panel. As we looked at the pandemic has really highlighted the critical need for robust broadband connectivity in both upstream and downstream, as we work from home, online schooling, connecting with our family and just all our essential services, could be healthcare, health monitoring, telehealth sessions, so many things are, we've become so dependent. And overnight, we've become, Zoomaholics, right? So we get to sit in these wonderful Zoom conference calls and so forth. And so, but it's, when you think about critical infrastructure, fiber is not just broadband connectivity. What we're really talking about is economic development and really jobs. If we did a study at Chattanooga, which has, one of the first fiber communities in the country, and took a 10-year look back. And by putting fiber in Chattanooga, that delivered 9,516 new jobs and $2.7 billion of economic impact. But in addition to jobs, it also provides economic diversity. We look at LUS Fiber in Lafayette, Louisiana. That was a community that was kind of ebbing and flowing with the whole oil industry. And as you guys know today, if you went out to try to get gas, this industry can be boom or bust. And by being able to put fiber across Lafayette, they were able to diversify that community with other industries. Also, things like smart grid modernization. Again, in Chattanooga, by putting in fiber, they were able to avoid over 2 million customer interruptions. They had a 43% reduction in outage minutes. And they also had over a $500 million benefits during major weather instances. And then we look at, going to the future. If you don't have fiber, you're not going to have a robust wireless infrastructure, right? You think about, you got to get your wireless signal out of the air and into the ground at the first available point. And so fiber provides that path to our future, things like 5G, that high capacity, low latency, all the things we're going to do to be able to think about, autonomous vehicles, autonomous transportation, trucking, all those things. You think about how much money we're spending on road infrastructure, but it actually turns out if we can get fiber more deployed, then it puts less pressure on that road infrastructure. As we get to autonomous vehicles, we can completely eliminate stoplights and be able to eliminate traffic jams and be able to, put less pressure on putting all that money into asphalt and put it more into fiber and communication. So I can't think of anything more important. This kind of goes all the way back to the mid 30s when we had the Rural Electrification Act and being able to get, how it transformed, our quality of life by being able to get electricity. And now we're seeing how it's transformed us, enabled us to be able to make it through a pandemic. Hopefully we'll make it through this. And anyway, I think it really just sets us up for the future.
So Gary, before I let you off the hook, you did reference some of the academic work and some of the studies and work that Fiber Broadband Association has done. You've been taking a pretty deep dive in terms of the value proposition of fiber and how it compares to other technologies. So I know you gave us some examples, but just curious if you've got any other studies that you all have done that you could share with folks today.
Yeah, so the Fiber Broadband Association has a long history, and we're very heavily research oriented. We have a very strong technology committee, and our advocacy is supported. We use facts and expertise and research, and so we do an annual fiber deployment study, and we're looking at the progress of fiber. So, like if you take a look at an example, at the end of last year, we had 50.6 million homes that were passed with fiber to the home. And we have about 22.5 million homes connected. So that's about 40% of the US homes. But what was really interesting last year is about 88% of the fiber CapEx was for small providers. And so what we're seeing is that, we used to think about like Fios, the big Verizon or AT&T, when they were doing the, their DirecTV merger and trying to get 12.5 million homes connected to fiber. But what we've seen is a lot of communities have been left behind. And so whether they're a rural operator or they've gone to the municipality or utility, those communities have now stepped up. And so, and we're seeing, on average about 44% take rate on unique passings and about a 52% average market share where fiber is available. Some of our studies also looked at, when consumers have a choice between fiber and any other technology, fiber always wins, which kind of seems like a no-brainer. The other things that we've looked at are, how critical is broadband to where we live? And we see that, broadband ranks number 2 behind safe streets for community relocation. It's also ranks number 2 behind your laundry room and a little bit ahead of your great room and what's your value in your home. But we also, look at, we've done consumer surveys on looking at, how important broadband is to, for your families. And right at the top is being able to connect with friends and family. And that has not been more important than ever in the last year. We also see that, about over 6 hours a day are spent at home, now that we're spending a lot of time here. And upstream, a big push now for more upstream capacity. And, it's really frustrating because, we do see, hear a lot of rhetoric of, oh, you don't need this upstream and the networks are largely down. This whole upstream downstream thing came because broadband initially went over a twisted pair, right? It was over our phone line. And the only way that we could try to get as much bandwidth is we tried to just push bandwidth one direction, right? If you're trying to think about a shouting contest, if you shout louder one way than the other, you can get more what we call rate reach. And now that we have an environment, a noise-free environment like fiber, optically pure glass, we don't have to make these trade-offs and have to, do all these crazy things to try to, not see the issues we have with low upstream capacity. Other things that, I mentioned the Chattanooga study. I think that's a really important study that looks at all the economic impact. So, that's a great study we did. The other thing is we looked at is we did a study on how much money it would take to get fiber to 90% of America. And the number came out to $70 billion, which when you look at getting to where President Biden, it's no surprise that $100 billion is the magic number. And so we're seeing that in a lot of the legislation as well as the infrastructure plan. Anything that's related to fiber and customer experience or the pandemic, we're doing a study on that. We have a couple new studies coming out. We have a new digital divide study coming out. We have a fiber versus fixed wireless. And maybe many of you probably saw, we had Mike Romano join us and we did a joint study with NTCA on LEO satellite we were kind of horrified that the FCC was looking at giving, almost $1 billion to the second richest man in the world to deploy low Earth orbit satellites. And we just provide a model for the FCC to be able to vet that long form application. And really, what we found is that over 56% of those RDOF locations will have broadband congestion if Starlink only deploys to those RDOF locations. If they deploy to even 20% to other subscribers, that means that almost 80% of those RDOF locations will have congestion. But anyway, that's a long-winded way to say that lots of great stuff going on at Fiber Broadband Association.
Oh, and great studies that you all have done. And I just want to share, we look at it in NTCA, the Rural Broadband, our membership. Our latest survey showed that 70% of their customer base has access to fiber. So again, these providers are really seeing that need. So to that point, Jim, one of the things I think that you and your team have been so renowned for is the models that you've built. And you've built models that look at fiber as a baseline for broadband deployment. So, kind of curious to ask, why have you built the models the way that you have, and what prompted looking at fiber as the choice of underlying technology for network deployment? A little bit of insight into some of the work you all have been doing.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Shirley, and thanks for having me on the panel today. When we talk to company leaders, the engineers at the companies, state policymakers, federal policymakers, and we ask them a question of, if you were able to deploy today to provide broadband, what would you want to do? And to a T, everybody answers, we'd love to deploy fiber. The issue then becomes, what are the economics and what's the payback on that fiber? And how can we afford to do it? So that's kind of what drives it. But as you think about fiber, it's got a long life. It's a 20+ year investment that you make, so we know it'll be around. It's robust and it's future-proof in that as the broadband requirements continue to exponentially grow, fiber is able to meet that. We know copper can't. Fixed wireless is challenged as the capacity grows and the take rate grows. So we all look at this, or the people I talk to all look as fiber as that solution. And it also, as Gary mentioned, provides additional attributes, kind of externalities that you need to consider when you're looking at the deployment. Those externalities are, well, it supports 5G, and we're all interested in getting that 5G out there. That 5G will support autonomous vehicles. It supports smart cities, Internet of Things. All that is supported in externalities of that deployment that you need to consider in that economic viability that you look at. But again, as we talk to policymakers and corporate leaders, all of them look at fiber as that ultimate solution for providing broadband to their customers and for other needs that may arise.
No, appreciate that and appreciate your good work there. So Ernesto, I think of you as somebody who really has consumers and end users, top of mind. And I'm kind of curious to hear your perspective on what kind of applications that you think are best served by fiber. What things you see today, where are we going tomorrow, that are driving this real need for fiber as compared to other technologies that might be available.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I mean, I think there's kind of the two markets I would suggest thinking about. Like, there's the market of like what we kind of perceive today, and then there's the market of, if you build a capacity, what innovators will come up with to make use of it. And if you look at all of the, so I'll talk about that second one first. If you look at all of the kind of advancements in internet services and applications, those all came when the broadband capacity was made available. It didn't happen in the reverse, meaning, for example, Zipcar's founder, Robin Chase, had the idea of Zipcar, but like really couldn't deliver until the wireless network got up to a certain capacity. And then if you think about kind of the iterative steps that came from there, Uber and Lyft, right? Those came from 4G and beyond. So, every advancement in capacity we can, increase in terms of the infrastructure, someone's going to come up with a million ways we can make use of it, in ways we just couldn't even fathom. Now, in terms of markets of today, I think the upload side of what high capacity symmetrical speeds can deliver is it enables people to be producers at home. I think Gary was absolutely right in pointing this out, and I think it's super important for everyone who's in the policy space to understand this. The asymmetric nature of broadband has nothing to do with broadband, and has everything to do with the infrastructure decision of how that data is delivered. We chose distribution networks to become broadband companies, cable TV and kind of low capacity telephone wires. And now we have a choice of what that future should look like. And if you choose fiber infrastructure, not only are you talking about something that can do your gigabit speeds, your 10 gigabit speeds, and your terabit speeds well into decades out from now, but it could do it in kind of any way you need to meet the future, what the services look like. So if you need even faster uploads, say the world becomes where upload becomes the dominant feature of internet usage, fiber networks can handle that. They can kind of shift and make use of the capacity in that way. And I can say with extreme confidence that those markets are coming because there are about 1 billion of these lines being laid in the advanced Asian markets. So you have symmetrical gigabit networks being laid out in China, South Korea, Japan. And so if we want Silicon Valley of tomorrow to be here in the United States, we have to have the infrastructure that allows experimentation and development of those applications. I think one of the, and I think Jim mentioned it as well as you, Shirley, the thing with fiber is that we're talking about speed of light communications. And so we're talking about near instantaneous type of interactivity. And I think any service such as what we do with video conferencing, what we do with cloud computing, any sort of collaborative work that requires me to give you a high amount of data at the same time you're sending it to me. Those are the things that are enabled by high capacity symmetric services in a speed of light communication, vacuum sealed glass pipe. You can't do that with satellite. You can't do that with most wireless plays. And to the extent that we want to ensure a community can make use of everything that the internet kind of births, if you will, they need to have the infrastructure on the ground to make use of it. Otherwise, what you will have is what we kind of have now. We're all familiar with the idea of, people have some basic internet service in places, but really can't do X and it really can't do Y. If you want that can't do list to grow, then don't give them fiber. Right, because that is where the world is going. That is where the future is going, and if we aren't investing appropriately to provide capacity, then we're just saying there should be communities that just don't get to use the full use of the internet at the end of the day.
And it has been so interesting to me. I think both you and Gary kind of hit on the symmetrical speed and the pushback that you get from some folks about, well, why bother? I will share anecdotally, I've been reaching out to some of our companies and they're talking about, 80 to 100% increase in, their customer uploads and the demand for that. And I think thinking through, what that really means in a digital economy. So thank you. No, I appreciate that greatly. So Gary, one of the things that you have noted, you talk about your research. Your research really indicates that the demand for and the usage of broadband speeds are increasing at a really rapid pace over time. Can you talk a little bit about where we might be heading and why fiber is actually the right technology of choice for those demands? How do we meet these demands? Ernesto just basically laid the path for where do we go forward as a country? Welcome your thoughts there.
Thanks, Shirley. And, we hear a lot about technology neutral. And, so that's kind of like, even I had Commissioner Carr on one of our virtual conferences in December, and he was saying, well, he's responsible for wireless and at the FCC, and, we shouldn't keep raising these speeds up because, we need to have a competitive field. And if all of a sudden, fiber outpaces everybody, then, there won't be any competition with other technologies. Fiber is a media, it's like air, twisted pair, coax. These are a waveguide, and the technology is the electronics, right? And that's, we looked at GPON, XGS-PON, there's all kinds of, technologies that can go on that, but it's really, this is the media. And if you think about, there's really 3 immutable laws of broadband. And, we think about, first is signal to noise ratio. The second is spectrum, how much hertz you have. And then the third is bits per hertz. And so, if you think of signal to noise ratio, it's, if you're in a quiet room, you can whisper, right? And you can hear like, the pin drop from old Sprint commercials, right? And that's by having a optically pure environment that's noise free. If you guys have all driven down the road and trying to get a radio station and get interference and things like that. So we know that EMI on the twisted pairs and things in the air and rain fade and all these things going on. But if you have a perfectly quiet, noise-free environment, then you can have theoretical limits on capacity. And that's why fiber is able to deliver limitless capacity. And then you think about spectrum, right? We talk about all this, how much spectrum, well, if airwaves are on cable and so forth, you have to worry about, all this interference between other things on there. But if you have now a dedicated optically pure environment, now you have, endless spectrum to be able to use. And then the third area is, how do you pack more bits per hertz? And I always think of like a juggler, right? If you're in a, no one's around, you can throw a bunch of balls in the air, but then if you start getting, crowded, right, you only can have so many balls. And so the more noisy environment you are, the less bits per hertz. And so that's why fiber is, the media that allows you to have this, theoretically perfect environment to be able to have, limitless capacity, low jitter, low latency. And that's why that's everybody's end game, right? And so if you look at, we see a lot of the rhetoric, if I mentioned about, rural America has all the speed they're going to need. You don't need all this upstream. But what we're seeing is that on average, 2016, if you look at the FCC data, we were seeing about 55 megabits downstream and about 19 megabits upstream. And then this past year, when the FCC data came in, it was more about 180 downstream and about 65 meg upstream. So that's growing at about, a CAGR of 28% a year. And so if you just project that out, we're going to be somewhere around 1.5 gigabits on average. This is kind of Ookla projection, and about 600 meg upstream. We also did a study at the Fiber Broadband Association, did kind of a bottoms up view, and looked at all the different applications, and you start thinking about, well, now I got my Peloton that's got this big video screen, and I got all my Nest doorbell and all these things going on. And looking at counting all those things up, we came up with, in the next decade, we're going to need about 2 gig symmetric. There will be people that argue that, oh, well, this is not just a linear or exponential curve, but it kind of is going to start capping out logarithmically. that's nonsense, right? We're not even, this is like, back in the beginning of the 1900s when the patent office said, I think we got all the patents we're ever going to get. I mean, this is like people with no vision to think that we are at the point where we're going to cap out on what bandwidth we need. We are insatiable about broadband. We can't get enough, and this will not change. And as we get into more applications and, more innovation, you can see that, this is just steroids. The more bandwidth you get, the less latency, less jitter, the more things that we'll be able to do as for quality of life. And we start looking at medical and, education and all those things. So anyway, we're seeing it somewhere it's going to be, that 1.5 gig to 2 gig in about a decade.
Mm-hmm. And, it's so interesting, Gary, when you reference that, a lot of times in the industry, we throw around, speeds, and consumers, I think what's more interesting to consumers is applications. So when you start saying, your gaming system, your Nest, your Peloton or Mirror, make it real for consumers to understand. So that's interesting. So Jim, one of the things that you had referenced, you said you work with these companies and they basically look at you and say, can we afford it? So, you're working with companies that are working to make effective and efficient technology choices for their networks. Can you talk a little bit about the business case for fiber that you're working with these companies? What makes it harder to deploy fiber, for example, in rural areas? And what have you learned from working with some of the small community-based broadband entities that are out there?
Yeah, so when you think of fiber, or actually any land-based network, you have to run along the roads to serve the customers. And as you think about that, the more customers you have on the roads, the cheaper per customer it is. So what we look at in kind of the economic side is linear density. So how many customers per road mile of cable can I connect to that system to understand kind of that cost per home pass? So if you think of $30,000 per road mile to construct fiber, maybe on the low end in some areas, maybe on the high end in other areas. But if you only have 10 customers per road mile, you're talking $3,000 per home pass, which potentially may be viable. It gets to the edge of viability depending upon the take rate you get. So that's really what you need to look at. And I worked with Dr. Steve Parsons. We're putting out a paper that's coming out soon that looks at the rural economics of fiber. And in that, we look at linear density, and typically the crossover point is right around 10 to 15 homes per road miles, where it becomes a challenge. And that challenge is what we're facing today in the country, and why Congress is looking at billions of dollars to push out to those areas. So let me talk about where we're at today. When we look at the latest FCC numbers and some estimates that we've put together, we have about 60 to 65 million homes and businesses passed with fiber. In our models, the typical cost per location passed is about $1,200. That's a greenfield number. So that includes the cost of the pole, the cost of conduit, the cost of your hub or your central office, whatever it may be, all boiled together to say, it's $1,200. And that is an affordable number that people can go out and make a positive business case. We then look at the next increment. The next increment are those that are not served by fiber, but served by cable systems. And that's about 74 million locations in the country served by cable systems. We know the cable systems are doing fiber deep. They're pushing fiber farther out because of the capacity constraints that they're facing as broadband grows. But again, in those locations, when we look at if they were to build new fiber, again, it's around $1,200 to $1,300 per home pass. So now we get to the end part, the parts of rural America where we don't have cable, we don't have fiber. Typically, they're only served either by copper or potentially fixed wireless or satellite. So when we look at that, there's about 14.5 million locations in that last segment. The typical cost that we see if we were to run a brand new fiber network out to serve those customers is over $6,000 per home pass. that leads to a negative business case. When we look at the, a 30-year net present value of those last 14.5 million customers, that 30-year business case is over negative $100 billion. So how can we as a country afford to do that? And that's where you have to look at government funding to do that. And the infrastructure plan is targeting a good amount to address that situation. But also you have to look at innovative solutions to do that. And finally, you have to make the decision of, can we afford to do everyone? When we look at the last 2% of that $14 million, the cost per home pass for the last 2% is over $60,000. Is that a wise investment of money? I'm not going to say yes or no, but that's the decisions policymakers have to make, is at what point do we have to use an alternative technology for that? When we look at what companies are doing, what communities are doing, they're looking at innovative solutions, as well as states. When states look at building new roads, they're now considering putting conduit systems in those road projects to allow for efficient deployment of new fiber in those roads. So when Gary talked about infrastructure, the conduit systems and the fiber are part of that road structure that's being built so that we can have cost-efficient technologies. We're looking at new trenching techniques that allow carriers to deploy more cost-effectively in areas. So we're looking at different ways to bring that cost per home pass down, but there's still the issue of there is an economic gap that we need to figure out as a country. How do we solve that gap?
So before I let you totally off the hook, I also think an interesting point that your perspective might be really insightful on is what I hear from our operators is that fiber also reduces their OpEx. So as you're looking at the economic efficiency, there is that piece of, well, it eliminates the truck rolls. And honestly, in rural areas, sometimes those truck rolls are 2 hours out, 3 hours out. So any insights that you have on the OpEx side of the equation?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting flip because, I talked about the CapEx side. Fiber is much less expensive. It's a pass optical network, so you don't have electronics out in the field to maintain. Trouble reports drop. Provisioning is much simpler. In the studies that we've seen, the operational cost compared to a copper network and even a coax network drop 50 to 80% when you deploy fiber. So it's an efficient technology in that it will save you money over time. And when we look, we do valuation studies for companies as they consider either sale of the company or when the companies face property tax issues. And in that, we look at obsolescence adjustments for the fact that if you have a copper network, I'm going to pay you less for that copper network because if I had a fiber network, I wouldn't have all those operational costs into the future. I'd have a much less expensive network to maintain. So if I were to buy, or if I were to value a copper network, I need to bring that value down because of the operational costs associated with that network.
Excellent. Okay. So, all right, Ernesto, we've been talking about planting the ground, why it's so important. Now let's talk about 5G because, right, that is the buzz. We hear so much talk about 5G. We've got, I get policymakers who say, well, why are you worried about this stuff? Because it's all going to be about 5G anyway. So this is, people get really, very excited about it. But I think they missed the important interrelationship between fiber and 5G. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship when it comes to our nation's broadband future? And what do you think consumers will actually need?
Yeah, I think Gary may have mentioned this, and I often, we do a lot of work in the states in terms of the handful of states that do broadband infrastructure, and we really need to stop thinking about how do I subsidize a service and how do I subsidize an infrastructure that enables all services, because that is what fiber is. It may be people may not understand this, but every single, and I mean without exception, every single 21st century infrastructure that's being deployed that does broadband has fiber at its core. Low Earth orbit satellites have fiber to their base link stations that communicate with the satellites up above. They need that in order to deliver that latency. 5G is essentially 95 to 99% fiber because it's really, this is, what we're running into is physics now. So if I want to have a really high speed wireless connection to you, the user, physics limits the range of my tower in terms of its ability to reach, because the higher the frequency I need, which is what you need to deliver increased capacity or increased data and bandwidth, the more signal interference happens, physical obstructions, the weather, things that will just degrade the signal grow the higher the wireless speed you need, which means those towers need to be more dense. They need to be more, they just need to be shorter range and more kind of line of sight based. So if you don't have a lot of ubiquitous fiber throughout a community to connect those towers to, you're not talking about gigabit 5G and beyond. There's no other way around it. There's no magic that happens here. This is really kind of baked in physics engineering dynamics that dictate that if you want to have a high capacity wireless future, fiber is what you're actually talking about at the end of the day. I want to kind of add a bit to what Jim was saying a second ago on the OpEx, because part of my work at EFF is to interview and talk to lots of folks at the that are doing fiber now, and kind of the things they are seeing. And one of the things that really leapt out at me was I had a fiber provider out in Utah explain to me that in the old days when I ran the copper network, I needed a technician for every 1,000 homes. Now maybe one every 10,000 homes. It's clean, it's seamless, it rarely breaks down. I just don't need to have as much intensive of work to maintain and run the network. And when people need it twice as 20 to 30 to 50% more on the fly, it's already there. I don't actually have to do anything special for that. So there is huge value in terms of the savings that fiber delivers if the government really is going to get involved in investing in the infrastructure, the construction side, the capex. And it's not just in terms of reducing cost of running the network, but if we are serious about bringing down the price of broadband and affordability and all of these other kind of derivative benefits that I think Congress and the White House is very interested in, you have to have a network that not only can deliver that at a cost-effective basis, but also because consumption is always on the rise, and it's been on average, I think 21% for the last 40 years and counting. You need a network that can upgrade cheaply too, in terms of its capacity to deliver those speeds, faster speeds, 10 years out. I think Gary's absolutely right. We're going to be needing speeds in the hundreds and gigabit range within our lifetime. And if you don't have the infrastructure ready for that, then your infrastructure has gone obsolete. And then we have to come back again, as in terms of what to do about resolving that.
So I'd like to also reference you had done a really interesting blog post recently where you talked about Congress don't let ISP lobbyists sabotage fiber for all. I think we're in simpatico in terms of, this is a moment in time, and we have a potentially historic moment in time to really make the right investments at the right time, and not pave over potholes. So I'd love to just have you touch a little bit about your thought process as policymakers are talking 65 billion, 100 billion, and then getting folks to think about aiming higher and doing better.
Yeah, I mean, often what's happened in how we've subsidized broadband is we do small pots of money, and then we say do as much as you can with as little money as you can. And what does that translate into? It's usually in the pandemic era, it was mobile hotspots because we don't really have much else we can do quickly. And I think if you go to any community where schools had to rely on mobile hotspots to deliver remote schooling, they will tell you that failed. And the few communities that had fiber infrastructure already in the place. So I'll give you kind of two examples. There's the kind of the public model and the private model. In the Bay Area and East Bay, we have a fiber provider called Sonic, which is one of the larger private fiber providers in the country. And they were able to give communities free 3 months of free gigabit internet as a part of their pandemic relief package and their assistance. Because it's easy for them to just add on, if they're going to have 30, 40,000 new users out of the blue, they can just do it. They've got it. They've already got the wires in place. They've published kind of the surge in usage and the near zero impact on their network as a result. And in Chattanooga, you had the community kind of come together and raise money through philanthropy. For about $8 million, they're able to deliver 10 years of free internet, 100 symmetrical to every low-income kid in that community, and that's awesome, right? Like that's awesome, and it's only able to be done because that's a mature fiber network that has been paid off over the years, because that community made the decision to fiber long ago. And you don't see those stories replicated in places that lack that infrastructure, because it is just impossible by the matter of physics. And I think what it really kind of boils down to is we have long thought the largest national players are the solution for many of these problems. And what is actually true, and what should be understood if we do an infrastructure policy is localism and kind of the local broadband player, public and private. They're more motivated to get to everyone. They're more motivated to try and serve the community because they live there. And they're more motivated to take those investment dollars and not try to think about like what's the least amount of money I could spend to make the most profit out of, but more how do I spend this to really deliver a benefit that my kids will be happy with when someday they may in a private side, usually these are privately held and not publicly traded. It's like if I want to have the next generation of my kids and stuff to run this company someday, right? And I think the one state that really exemplifies this, and the 49 states that haven't, is North Dakota. North Dakota, for folks who don't realize, is it's almost around 2/3 fiber to the home. And they've taken every federal dollar, every subsidy, every penny that has gone towards broadband and just spend it on fiber. And if all 50 states were doing that from the beginning of when we subsidized broadband, which to this point we've spent $45 billion on like the lowest common denominator, whatever basic speed a copper wire network can deliver, which is 25.3. We don't have much to show for that kind of money, with the exception of one state which didn't go that route. They didn't build out 25.3. They built out gigabit symmetrical. And I think it is really essential that federal policy starts thinking about this as an infrastructure and no longer about like subsidizing any service we'll do. Future proofing is absolutely important, because you need to assume, because you have decades of confidence to make this assumption right now, that people will need more every year. And so if people will need more every year, and it takes you a handful of years to build out the infrastructure, what's good enough for today, tomorrow, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? And we know what that is, and that's fiber infrastructure. So if we can adopt technology neutrality as any sort of like premise, but we can't be expectations neutral. We can't be outcomes neutral. And if we are decisively making these choices of, I want to build something that will last, and I don't have to, as a government, I don't have to come back every 10 years or every 5 years and just spend another handful of billions of dollars to continue to incrementally upgrade. Well, with technical certainty, you know what that is. And sure, maybe something comes 20 years from now, but let's build the thing that's going to be good for a couple generations today. We know what it is today, and that's fiber.
Excellent. No, thank you. So I think we may have some questions. I'm not entirely sure if anybody submitted anything, but Lauren, what do we have?
Sure. Yeah, we do have a few questions here. And Shirley, I think this first one is a good question for you. And it is, are there any good examples of fiber projects serving areas with 30 or fewer households per square mile?
Oh, I look at our membership, and I will say our membership on average serves 7 consumers per mile. So the fact that 70% of our customer base has fiber access, we've got a lot of great examples, but I will just share a couple of them with you. All you have to do is look at something like Twin Lakes Cooperative in Tennessee that has not only built out their existing service territory with fiber, but is extended into some of those and underserved communities where folks have literally seen their construction trucks at the side of the road and have been known to chase those trucks saying, when are you going to bring fiber over here? Obviously, folks are hungry for it. So, but to Jim's point, My folks are able to do that in the field with that density of 7 subscribers per mile because of access to the Universal Service Fund, the ability of the high cost fund to help support those efforts to make it affordable for the consumer, which get lost in the debate. I mean, people talk a lot about, again, CapEx, OpEx, but its affordability is a really important factor too. And universal service is one of the most important affordability programs. So yeah, we've got literally hundreds of stories, but I have well over 170 gig certified communities across rural America that are NTCA members. And so every time everybody gets excited about Google Fiber, I keep thinking, you know what, we've got that in Dickinson, North Dakota. So, you know, there's a lot to celebrate, but we've got to keep going. So I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to answer to that. Ernesto seems to.
Yeah, I dug in, you know, often I hear the argument against fiber is it's too expensive to do in rural. And then I see dozens upon, you know, probably hundreds of examples of like, well, then how do they do it, right? Like, how do these folks do it if it's too expensive? You know, it really comes down to the financial model, right? And the support in terms of what's made available. I mean, when we are talking about the most difficult, and I would say the most difficult I've seen build was a Missouri cooperative that has done 2 per mile. And so to me, that's the most incredibly aggressive and difficult I've ever seen. And they're charging $100 per month for gigabit fiber. And to kind of put that in context, because we're debating this in DC, Starlink costs $100 right now. And so, you know, for maybe 100 down and maybe 20 up, depending, and you don't really have the persistent connectivity if you have interruptions. So for you can have a household pay $100 a month for gigabit fiber, which can go to 10 gigabits, 100 gigabits and beyond, or $100 for the exact same price for 100 down, 20 up. So what are we subsidizing, right? Like, what are we going to think about in terms of the investments? And you know, to me, that's the metric is you can get pretty darn far, especially if you really think about is, you know, akin to the electrification effort where we're recruiting communities, teaching them how to build and creating cooperatives. 2 per mile, that's as far as I've seen. And at $100 a month for an essential service that people will need, that's awesome. I mean, that is awesome, and is something that will last them for their life and their kids' life.
So I'm going to take you out to Golden West in South Dakota, where you will get to see areas where there is one, and the cost of reaching some of those customers is about $20,000 per customer. But Golden West is plodding along, trying to get people connected. So we'll get you out on a field trip. And the other point that I would add to Ernesto's comment about Starlink is, you know, the $100 a month plus the $500 starter package. So when you start plugging in those economics, it's important to think about that too. Lauren?
We have a few more. What do you think about the possible change in the government definition of broadband from 25 to 100 megs?
Gary?
You know, so the pushback we've heard on this, right, is if you raise the definition, you know, so a decade ago, right, we had the National Broadband Plan, and that was based on broadband being defined as 1 megabit, right? And that was a big jump up from our 760 kilobits. And, you know, so we're going to have 1 megabit, right? And if you can imagine the pandemic when we had 1 megabit, it would not have worked out so well. And so the pushback is, well, if we raise it from 25.3 to something else, then there's going to be more unserved, you know, everybody will be unserved. And so then, you know, those areas that don't have broadband will never get it because we'll, you know, keep subsidizing the same areas. And at the end of the day, you know, if you don't have 100 meg symmetric at least or better, you're underserved. So no matter what the definition is, you're not being able to get the, you know, I teach at the university, and one of my student teams worked on a DE&I project here. They just finished, and we looked at zip codes in prosperous areas. You know, certain zip codes were just left behind, and why were they? Since they just took all the census data, did a triple regression analysis, and it popped out 3 things. First is if you're paying over 30% of your income towards rent. Second, if you don't have access to broadband and computers, and third, if you don't have higher education. Well, those all seem to me that if you don't provide broadband, you are basically, you know, leaving these, you know, I'd love to have Ernesto talk more about digital equity, but, you know, when we talk about, you know, if you $60,000 or $20,000 to reach, it costs $69,000 to put someone in prison for a year. So, the cost of not getting these communities broadband and being able to provide it, but, absolutely, the minimum should at least get up to 100 meg symmetric, and we should keep going because, innovation is not stopping.
Ernesto?
Yeah, if I can add, I mean, I think it is absurd that 25.3 is even considered a standard today, but it's really this, the lowest common denominator should be our measurement of success, and that's ridiculous because the rest of the world has moved on. Europeans have already adopted a gigabit standard and kind of talk about their infrastructure policies around a gigabit society. As I mentioned earlier, you have 1 billion lines of gigabit connectivity being laid in the advanced Asian markets. And so if America is going to measure its success on like how many 25.3 connections can be out there, we're talking about a speed that's 40 times slower on the download and several hundred times slower than the global average that's being built right now. And that's a recipe for failure. And I think we are connectivity and speed increases and kind of the infrastructure and the hardware, it's grown exponentially. And so we should be raising our standards to kind of meet where the technology is rather than figuring out how do we have the last person in the race still qualify for sufficient. Because that's just not logical. No one builds 25.3 if they got start from scratch. I think Jim covered that exactly right. You build something that's going to last for the future, not something that is linked to the past.
So Jim, would truly welcome your perspective here as well.
Yeah, it's personally, I think it should be above 100. And when we talk to state leaders who guide state programs, many of those state leaders that we've worked with in the past and are working with today all are pushing for at least 100 megabits, because I think they all observe that 25 is insufficient for what's needed today. And if they want to support a robust economy within their state, they want to get 100 out. When New York ran their reverse auction a number of years ago, where they were pushing out money, their minimum speed that they were targeting was 100 megabits. And they were able to get, I think, about 98% of the state up to that speed limit. Just because the state leaders have taken upon themselves to say, this is what we need. So I think it's really policymakers need to understand what it is that guides the benefits to the population, the benefits to the economy. And I don't think 25.3 is really what's going to give us a benefit to the economy. And it really needs to be upped.
Lauren.
We have, I think, time for one more, and this is a good one, I think, to end us, especially as we launch this Fiber Delivers campaign. And the question is, are there any good primers or resources that can support policymakers with the basic concepts of fiber, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, and so on, and breaking down how internet reaches homes and buildings? We get questions from policymakers about this all the time, especially those who think that Wi-Fi hotspots are enough and that they have done enough using CARES funds to make short-term connections available.
Who wants to take it?
So I can start off. EFF actually wrote a white paper from our engineering team. It's titled "The Case for Fiber to the Home Today: Why Fiber is the Superior Medium for 21st Century Broadband." And we wrote that a little over 2 years ago. And so I encourage everyone to look. I can, if we could share the link, I'm happy to share the link. But just the Case for Fiber to the Home, EFF, if you just do a search for that, you'll find it. And all we do is just break down physics. We just explain the physics behind broadband connectivity, and then we just analyze each of the different types of medium, so cable, wireless, and so forth, and explain their limitations and advantages. And it's just indisputable as to what fiber holds in terms of its capacity.
You were visionaries 2 years ahead of your time, weren't you? Jim.
I don't know if I have a good resource. When the National Broadband Plan came out, 10 years ago, it was a great resource. I think we need something updated to help policymakers through that. And what Ernesto mentioned, I think, is a good starting point. But I don't have a good thing off the top of my head I can point people to.
Terrific. Gary, any thoughts from you?
Well, I was going to suggest Ernesto's white paper. We have that actually on our website because we love that white paper, and we love everything that Ernesto does. But we do have, and if you come to our website, we have definitely a number of reports and one-pagers. As I mentioned, we were putting out a number of one-pagers coming up on the latest one's going to be on the digital divide. Then we're also, wireless versus fiber to the home. We've done a nice study on satellite versus, or LEO satellites versus fiber to the home, and fixed wireless on fiber to the home. So we've done a number of technology comparisons, and then also, the economic impact assessments, because it's really not about technology. It's really about jobs and quality of life. And, I think as our panelists have all said, it's really important that, you put a, long-term solution in place. Even you think about all the money we're spending on like broadband affordability. When we're trying to subsidize, I've had people call me up and say, yeah, I'm spending $350 a month for horrible internet because I hit my data cap on my wireless 3 days into the month, and I go to my satellite, and then, and so you're spending all this money and we're subsidizing that. If we were able to get this infrastructure and we could, be able to repurpose that money on, helping people adopt broadband. I was meeting with Northeast Louisiana, and there's entire parishes, they don't participate in the internet. I mean, it's hard to fathom, but when you don't have connectivity, you just go about your daily life, just, assuming that the internet doesn't even exist. And so it's really hard to get ahead and be able to keep up if you're, darkened to the whole, internet. And so I do think it's really important, and Ernesto is the expert on digital equity, but I think it's just so critically important that, we're able to make sure that every zip code, no zip code is left behind,
Well, actually, what a perfect place to end, right? No zip code is left behind, and the fiber seems to be what can deliver that future. So on that note, I want to thank each of you. You've all added some great insights today. We're probably going to look to, we're putting our Fiber Delivers paper up on our website. I believe it will also be on the Fiber Broadband Association website. We'll make sure that we can make it available to everybody who joined us today, along with Ernesto's Fiber to the Home paper that was done even before the pandemic. But again, I feel like a conversation might be worthy in a couple more months to see where we're at and see what is going on in both the states and on the federal level. So again, my sincere thanks to our three panelists who lend so much intellectual capital to the discussion, and to everybody who joined us today.